very difficult to really say with any certainty what kind of conditions we're going to have for race day tomorrow. So who knows? We might have something resembling this for the 23-lap Moto2 battle tomorrow. The greater concern tomorrow, really, for all three classes of Grand Prix racing are the strong winds which are forecast for tomorrow. Something approaching what we saw yesterday, if not slightly worse, with the gusts potentially reaching as high as 70 kilometres an hour. One rider, though, enjoying the extra power and speed that the wind gave him yesterday was David Alonso.
Yeah, David Alonso, third fastest at the end of practice, and super fast and consistent as well. Certainly one of the names that will be up there fighting for the podium if we were to base that on yesterday's practice session. Great to see some Colombian fans in supporting the reigning 2024 Moto3 World Champion. Alonso looking very good. And one key area that he needs to improve, and if he can do that, he can maybe be up on the same kind of level as Senna Aegis. It was a decent day as well for even Tola, who was just on our screens. He was just narrowly outside the top 14, down in 16th. But first day here on the Moto2 machine yesterday went okay, went a lot better than it did for this rider. Danny Holgado has been the revelation of this year in Moto2. Been the star of the second half of the championship in some ways as well, but he had a nightmare day, didn't he, Lewis?
And interesting, when you listen to rookies across all three Grand Prix classes, they say that what you need around here is just laps. You need to just do lap after lap after lap to understand how to truly master this circuit. Holgado cost himself a ton of laps yesterday with a crash at Lukey Heights. He also said that from returning to the racetrack after that crash, it took him a little bit of time, not that he had much of it at the end of the session, to rebuild his confidence. Only was able to put in around about 5 laps in the session overall. And those, of course, were all after his crash, which came on his first timed lap. So Holgado 21st, he was pleased with the limited progress he made, but it was limited progress in just 5 laps. And of course, so often we see the Aspar team putting in race simulations on Saturday morning. Holgado is not going to be making up any lost time in conditions like this.
Yeah, he really is going to be on the back foot going into tomorrow's race. Here's Danny. Said there's a little bit of pain in his right foot after that crash up at Lukey Heights, but generally he is A-OK, which is certainly good to hear. Huertas was a little unfortunate to miss an automatic way through into Q2. He was 15th, just one place off the top 14 yesterday afternoon. Just over 700ths of a second, but the reigning World Supersport champion, or the outgoing World Supersport champion, does have some good experience of Phillip Island. Maybe not in this kind of conditions, though. He's used to coming here in February when things are a little bit warmer and weather tends to be a little more settled.
Cycling through a couple of riders here who don't have particularly fun and enjoyable recent experience on Phillip Island. Moments ago you saw Marcos Ramirez, who crashed at Siberia and launched his American racing Cadillacs in the direction of one of our cameramen when he went down. He recovered from that in the end to, well, take 24th place, if you can consider that a recovery. He needs to improve in qualifying one. Celestino Vietti, who we saw next, had a crash in each session yesterday. He was even further down the order than Ramirez. 26th for Celestino Vietti. And for a weekend, Neil, or for a circuit where Luca Boscoscuro usually turns up here expecting victory rather than hoping for it, his riders way down the order yesterday.
Yeah, horrible day for Boscoscuro's men in that Speed RS team. Alonso Lopez down in 23rd, Vietti a nightmare afternoon as well, all the way down in 26th. Yeah, far cry from the times when Alonso Lopez and Fermin Aldeguer were absolutely dominating the show here. You can see that the green flag is on and no one really seems to be in too much of a rush. Unsurprisingly.
When you're ready, boys.
Yeah, to go out and get some lap times. Thankfully, it looks as though Alonso Lopez will go out and assess some of the conditions. I'm assuming he's got wet tyres on, front and rear. It looks like it.
Yeah, certainly is a wet on the front tyre. I would imagine the rear tyre likewise. Up behind him, Adrian Huertas is going to join him out there and give him some company on this wonderful 4.448 kilometre Phillip Island circuit, 2 3/4 miles in length. Beautiful ribbon of tarmac with the undulation change. 1 or 2 bumps though that have been catching the rider's attention, particularly if you're on a MotoGP bike. And it will feel like ice in conditions such as this, with rain having fallen and not a great deal of track temperature to help dry it out either.
Good to see at least some riders going out and tackling the conditions. Danny Holgado just needs to get some laps under his belt, and he admitted that it took a little bit of time to rebuild his confidence after that crash up at Lukey Heights yesterday. in practice. Philip Salac is another rider that's been having a real tricky time of it. He didn't have a crash yesterday, but he had a big rear end slide, a big moment where he was out of the seat. And when he came back down, he actually tweaked his right shoulder that he injured all the way back at Assen during qualifying for the Dutch TT, when he had contact, I think, with Alonso Lopez, wasn't it? And that forced him to retire out of the Dutch race the following day. Watch out for the seagulls there, Alonso.
Max Keenes nearly wiped one of those out yesterday.
Thankfully, they managed to get out of the way just in time. But yeah, Salac was saying that really not sure whether, well, he's going to try it out obviously, but he thinks it's going to be a very complicated weekend with his shoulder in so much pain. So hopefully he was able to find some kind of remedy for that pain last night and this morning.
Enjoyed the very scientific method of Fermin Aldeguer and his crew chief Frankie Carcetti just halfway up pit lane there, trying to work out how wet the track is. Just wipe it with your hand and just see how much water comes up on the palm of your hand. Fermin Aldeguer will be out on track in around about 40 minutes or so time when MotoGP are out there for free practice 2. Like some wildlife that was on the inside of turn 10 there as Adrian Huertas was navigating his way around it. This is the final sector now, the final couple of left-handers of turns 11 and 12. Normally in the dry in Moto2, you're taking this final corner in 4th gear at around about 100 miles an hour, 160 kilometers an hour, but very little lean angle for Adrian Huertas as he begins his first time lap of the morning.
This is definitely a session not to push to the maximum at the moment, you would say. Obviously it counts towards nothing. We were already qualified and not qualified for Q1 and Q2 this afternoon. And as we saw last year, Lewis mentioned it at the top of the broadcast, this can be quite a lethal session when conditions are like this, as we saw with Joe Roberts last year. So everyone will just be keen to stay out of trouble. Doesn't seem quite as blustery as it was yesterday, Lewis. And we have to say, during the MotoGP riders debriefs yesterday afternoon, there was quite a lot of talk from the MotoGP riders that maybe we would have a bit of a 2023 situation. Obviously the forecast with big gusts of wind, which is believed to be the case for tomorrow. A few riders were saying they might actually prefer to have the main race today, but it looks as though we're going ahead with the original schedule. The sprint will be taking place at 3 p.m. local time as always, and then we'll be having our 3 Grand Prix races on Sunday. But yeah, let's see how the conditions are, at least tomorrow. It is supposed to be dry. It is supposed to be a good deal warmer than it has been yesterday and today as well, so that could well play in our favour.
Yeah, the decision on whether the Grand Prix was to be shifted from Sunday to Saturday, certainly made by people way above my pay grade, but you would imagine if that decision were to be taken, it would have been taken by now. We got news on the Friday night, didn't we, a couple of years ago. In 2023, it's not quite as simple as just saying, okay, you're going to do twice the distance tomorrow afternoon, boys, go out there and race. Plenty of other things that need to be organised, put in place, not least all the broadcasters need to be informed to be able to modify their TV schedules for a Grand Prix rather than a sprint. So we will be sprinting this afternoon over 13 laps, 3 p.m. local time. If you're a little unaware of the time difference, we're coming to 9:30 at the moment here as the red flag comes out in this Moto2 practice session, just as Alonso Lopez is about to complete his lap. No indications at the moment on our screens as to the cause of that.
Do we maybe have some wildlife on the track? No indications that someone has crashed. We didn't see any yellow flags.
I thought I saw something down into turn 10 when Huertas was coming around, but we'll get further confirmation, I'm sure, very, very shortly. Some indication. We've certainly not had any notice of a rider crashing in this session, which is obviously your first fear when a red flag comes out. But if there is any kind of wildlife that's on the racetrack, the marshals will immediately inform race direction, and generally when that happens, for the safety of not least the riders but also the animal in question, they bring a halt to the session, just as Ethan Guevara and Aaron Canet were on the verge of going out onto the racetracks. They're now having to wheel their bikes the wrong way down pit lane. Of course, if you go through a red light in these sessions, you're likely to cop a penalty too.
They caught the red flag just in time, as they would have had to have done an outlap to come all the way back in again. So no indication what has happened, but this being Phillip Island, wildlife can sometimes have a bit of an impact on some racing conditions. We saw some seagulls precariously close to the exit of pit lane whenever Alonso Lopez was exiting as the first rider to do so in this session.
Having a bit of fun there, I think, with his team who are pushing his Fantic Alex back towards the box. Give me a push, guys, come on. Won't wait all day. cadet is now on his way back to the box. Here he is. Because he's certainly seeing the lighter, funny side of a false start to his morning's action. So 5 minutes completed in this Moto2 free practice 2 session. Clock is stopped, of course. At the moment, only one lap time on the board. Adrian Huertas, who put in a 1:49.750. So the thick end of 20 seconds down on what we were doing yesterday in slightly warmer and much drier conditions. Celestino Vietti and Luca Boscascoro are also able to share a bit of a joke, which is something of a surprise given how their Fridays went. A crash in either session for Vietti. Huertas now informing the team of what he saw. Whatever the cause of the red flag, the session is restarting in a minute and a half time. 9:34 local time. We'll be back up and running. As we do see some seagulls once again making their way into rather dangerous surroundings. Exited pit lane. So this delay, this halt to proceedings will be a rather short one. And in just over 60 seconds, we'll be back up and running.
Yeah, we have had red flags in previous years for, I think, geese crossing the track up around the hay shed. Yeah. Obviously seeing quite a lot of seagulls down by turn 1. There's one actually still on the pit lane exit. No word as of yet as to why we've had this red flag, but it looks as though we didn't have any crashes. So we can only speculate at this present time, but the fact that we're going to be getting back up and running again very, very soon indicates that it was nothing too serious, I believe. So yeah, 1 minute or less than 1 minute and we'll be back underway again. This rider here, Alonso Lopez, will get another chance to go back out and try and refine some of his good feeling, some of his confidence, even if it is in wet conditions here. Good to see that despite the rain this morning, despite the slightly gloomy conditions at some point, fans have still come through the turnstiles in their droves this morning.
Well, we haven't had any information officially from us, but we thank our former colleague Matt Dunn, who is down in pit lane in his role with Mark Vied. Yes, we believe that Adrian Huertas is connected with some wildlife out on the racetrack. We did see him gesturing to his team that he had seen or hit something. And yeah, we have seen some smartphone footage from down in pit lane of Huertas' motorcycle, which is in some places a slightly different colour than when he left the pit lane earlier on in the morning. So unofficial information, but that is what we understand to be the cause of the stoppage. We've also had some information from race direction too, that it was indeed a stray bird, which unfortunately might now be to quote Monty Python, not an ex-pigeon but an ex-seagull potentially, that's met a rather grisly end in this Moto2 session. And those are the perils of a circuit like this, in a surrounding like this. Of course, it's a danger to the riders too. Of course, we make light of the Andrea Iannone famous incident from 10 years ago on the drop end to MG, but not only can it do you some damage if you hit it straight on, but of course it can potentially cause you to crash and do some further damage too. But conditions such as this, and given what we're dealing with, it's not an easy kind of situation to police, is it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, how do you stop wildlife coming onto the track when we're so close to the track, or so close to the sea, I should say? Is it a case of trying to build fences so big, but if they're birds, they can just fly over those fences, surely? So, yeah, it's
got a major advantage over the rest of us.
Can't really think of a major solution that could eradicate that problem, to be honest. But it has been something that's affected racing here. If you go back through the history of Phillip Island, I remember in World Superbikes a couple of times, it was Colin Edwards getting smashed in the face back in the mid-90s on his way down towards turn 1. It looks as though Huertas' mechanics are on the situation. Some bodywork has potentially been brought out. And you can see them just making some running repairs. Didn't get any shots of exactly what happened. Still awaiting full confirmation here, but it does seem as though that is the reason for the red flag.
I do wonder whether it was into turn 10, because of course it was a right-hander that Huertas would have been going through, leaned over on his right-hand side, and certainly the footage that we've seen, it's on the that front right corner as the rider looks. of the bike, where perhaps he's connected with something. So some unforeseen repairs now going on at Italtrans to enable Huertas to rejoin the session. But the sun is now out here at Phillip Island. So without a hint of irony, given the weather that we were experiencing around about 20 minutes ago, which will hopefully help in drying this track out as Jake Dixon now makes his way into turn 1. Feels he's in touch, doesn't he? Perhaps not the outright fastest yesterday. Certainly was the fastest Boscoscuro. The only Bosco inside the top 7 yesterday was Dixon. Just after a little bit of better turning on board his Boscoscuro to close the gap to the likes of Moreira, Aegis and Alonso. Yeah, there was definitely a bit of a downshift in enthusiasm, I feel, for what was possible here after yesterday's running from Jake Dixon on Thursday. He was full of beans, pretty confident, thinking that the Boscoscuro would be a match for anyone around these curves, as it has been in years gone by. But as Lewis said yesterday, he said there was just a bit of a lack of turning generally, and wasn't quite able to live with the likes of Senna Aegis over a longer run, but still very much, I would say, in the podium battle. I think you could probably say that Senna Aegis was a bit clear of the rest of the field when we were looking at the longer run at the start of the practice session, maybe in the first 2/3 of the session when riders were putting in 13, 14 lap runs. If you're looking at riders that could do lap times in the 1:30 30s, which was an exceptionally fast pace, essentially close to lap record pace, Aegis was able to do 7 laps in those 1:30 30s during his longer run yesterday afternoon. David Alonso was able to do 4, and then I think we had Diogo Moreira and Aaron Canet both on 1 apiece. We also had Jake Dixon, who was doing pretty consistent, very low 1:30 31s. So he wasn't that far off the back of the likes of Moreira and Canet. But from what I could see, it looked as though Aegis is probably in the strongest position in terms of race rhythm. Then we have David Alonso, and then it's maybe 3 or 4 riders fighting for that final podium place. One name that we haven't mentioned at any stage in that analysis is the championship leader, Manu Gonzalez, who, if you weren't with us yesterday, had a big crash coming through the hay shed in free practice 1, and then also had a get-off coming into the Miller hairpin turn 4 late in the session. Turn 4, much slower crash than he had in the morning, but another dent to the confidence in his longer run. I'm using quote marks when I say that, because it was only 8 laps that he did at the start of the session. The best lap we saw from Gonzalez was a 1:31.3, where, as you say, Aegis, his teammate, did 7 laps under a 1:31 altogether. So there's no question that in terms of confidence, in terms of outright pace, Manu Gonzalez has some catching up to do if he's to challenge for the podium tomorrow. Yeah, big catching up to do for Manu Gas. And I'm pretty sure he will be absolutely despairing at the current conditions that we have, because having missed a good chunk of FP1, he is really on the back foot. Now we've lost this session to the conditions pretty much. Gonzalez is going to be going into qualifying with a good deal less experience and a good deal less speed, I think, than his rivals over a long race distance. Yeah, just trying to look at the sector times yesterday to see where perhaps he was losing most of his time. Generally in sector 3, really. That was where Aegis was making a lot of his time. The third sector here in Phillip Island takes in a lot of the fast stuff through the hay shed and up and over Lukey Heights. Aegis, in a sector that is only 17 seconds long on a Moto2 bike, was 2/10 near enough quicker than anybody else on the racetrack. And when you compare him to Gonzalez, he was a quarter of a second clear of Manu Gas, and Gonzalez in the final sector too was also losing a quarter of a second relative to Alonso, who we saw had a big step over the rest in that 4th sector. In fact, if you put Gonzalez's 4th sector against the rest, he was only 13th fastest through there. He's in touch near enough through sectors 1, and particularly in sector 2, he's as fast as anybody through that 2nd sector. But in the final half of the lap, particularly through, I guess, the faster left-handers of the final sector, and I guess perhaps with a little knock to the confidence through the high-speed corners coming through the hay shed, Gonzalez still leaving a little bit of time on the table there. Yeah, understandable if you have had a big crash through the hay shed. I believe it's around 120 miles an hour that he tipped off at yesterday morning. And I think you're going to maybe be holding your breath slightly through some of the faster turns on this track. And turns 11, turns 12, not for the faint-hearted. Yesterday, David Alonso was saying that the wind was so strong, buffeting riders around, that it was almost like you were dancing on the bike. As Dixon crashes down into the MG hairpin down at turn number 10.
Thankfully, that is at relatively low speed. But Jake Dixon has had a messy start to his Saturday morning here at Phillip Island.
So easily done in conditions such as this. Very sharply downhill into turn 10. The camera there does it a little bit of justice, but if you stood trackside, you'd certainly get a better example or a better idea of just how far you're dropping into there. And in the end, dropping the bike altogether was Dixon on the front end. You can see there how quickly the front end washed away. Classic wet weather crash that for the 96, who does still currently lead this session by the thick end of 2 seconds, so perhaps taking slightly more risks than most of the field out there.
Yeah, you could maybe say that. Dixon certainly looked as though he was pushing on, coming around Lucky Heights, rear end just kicking out, sliding somewhat, but it looks as though his session is far from over. He'll hopefully be able to get that bike back into the paddock soon enough. But yeah, just what I was saying, David Alonso said that the wind was buffeting riders around so much that it felt like he was kind of dancing on the bike. He was having to adjust his body position a lot to deal with it moving, and that was especially pronounced, I think, through the final double lefts, also through turn 1 as well. Pekka Bagnaia was actually saying in his debrief yesterday that he felt that the wind was pretty much on the limit yesterday of what was just about safe on a MotoGP machine. It doesn't seem to be quite as blustery at the moment here, which is certainly a positive. And as Lewis has pointed out, we do have some sunshine now. You can see the blue skies up above Manu Gonzalez, and yeah, with a bit of wind here, it doesn't really take a good deal of time to dry up.
Well, David Alonso said yesterday that with the wind, a tailwind down the main straight, he was doing 300 kilometres an hour down the main straight, but he said it felt like 350 with the wind pushing him down the Gardner Straight. But of course, if you do then have a tailwind, whether it's a tailwind or a headwind, down the main straight, that then becomes a crosswind into the first corner when you're tipping it in the dry here at around about 165 kilometres an hour, which makes it so easy just to wash the front away. If you get caught by a gust in the middle of that first corner, you're absolutely powerless to do anything about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was the one area of the track where David Alonso was really struggling down into turn 1. He said he was losing so much time through there. If you look at sector 1, he was about 3/10 slower in that sector alone than the likes of Diogo Moreira or Jake Dixon, Senna Agius.
He was 21st out of the 28 riders through sector 1.
Yeah, so still trying to understand exactly how to run the best line through that particular corner. If he manages to do that today in qualifying, then I think Alonso can certainly step up tomorrow and be in the running for the race win. And I'm just going to say this, we mentioned that Agius, Alonso looked a little bit better off in terms of rhythm than the likes of Canet and Moreira. Judging by how Moreira develops over a race weekend, if he's that fast on a Friday, do not be surprised to see him make a big step forward today when we eventually get dry conditions and in the race tomorrow, because that's just the way he rolls. He always manages to pick up his pace as the weekend progresses. Don't be surprised to see Moreira in the victory fight tomorrow either.
Yeah, and we know how tenacious Moreira is and just how hard he pushes in the Grand Prix itself. You just know, whatever happens, he's going to make a step forward when the incentive of points, podiums, and even a world championship is on the line for Diogo Moreira. Just how crucial was that late Q2 lap for the Brazilian in Indonesia, when it looked like he was not off the pace, but it looked like David Alonso had pole position bought and paid for on that particular Saturday afternoon. Moreira had other ideas, and that set the stage ready for him to lead Manu Gonzalez from the front in the Mandalika battle. A battle that Manu Gonzalez was unable to get back on terms with him in before, of course, he was then disqualified from the race. And that is why we are in such a tense and thrilling position in the World Championship with 4 races to go. Still 4, potentially 5 if you're particularly optimistic or you're a Jake Dixon supporter. In terms of the World Championship, Dixon's 59 points off Manu Gonzalez. Barry Baltus still in contention, 43 points back, but has to start winning and start winning fast if he's to close that advantage down. Canet, well, he's 33 points back after salvaging 3rd from 21st on the grid in Indonesia, promoted of course by Gonzalez disqualification. Moreira now just 9 points back after taking his victory and taking a maximum 25-point gap out of Gonzalez from 34 points down to 9, which is why Gonzalez was under so much pressure before he even arrived here in Phillip Island. Pressure that has intensified with his tough Friday.
Yeah, we We have said so often this year that Manu Gonzalez is pretty unflappable. He did show that yesterday when he jumped up and put in a very solid top 5 time at the end of practice to solidify his place in Q2 tomorrow. The race rhythm will still come, but there's no question he will be under all sorts of pressure here this weekend, and in slightly unpredictable conditions. When you're trying to defend a bit of a championship lead, it really cannot be the most ideal of circumstances, but I don't think Manu Gonzalez can really have that mindset anymore of defending a championship lead. He just needs to go out and start attacking again, and arguably he hasn't really been doing that so much in the last 5 or 6 races.
As I mentioned yesterday, Diogo Moreira has beaten Manu Gonzalez in 5 of the last 6 races. The only race where Gonzalez beat Moreira since the summer break was in Barcelona, when Moreira plummeted down the order in the latter stages. Whether that was Gonzalez just not being as fast as Moreira, or whether that was Gonzalez just playing the championship game and just recognising that, given how far back Moreira was, he was 60 points back when we arrived in Austria midway through August, that he didn't really need to worry about Moreira as a major title threat at that stage. He was more focused on Aaron Canet. That will certainly have changed now, with Moreira just 9 points behind him. As Jake Dixon's spell on top is finally ended. Dixon, as you can see there on screens, is back up and running and potentially going to take top spot back again. It's Guevara for the Blue Crew Pramac squad on a 141.102. Jake Dixon in second. Adji, who we saw up inside the top 6 yesterday, his best Friday so far in Moto2 third, from Ivan Ortola and Alonso Lopez. And if you watched us in Austin, you won't be surprised to learn that in these slightly iffy wet conditions, we have 4 Boscoscuros in the top 5.
You can see they're still nowhere near dry enough to attempt to go out on slick tyres. Tyres are the order of the day here. And yeah, Lewis is absolutely right. When we've had wet conditions this year, the Boscoscuros really have risen to the top, as witnessed in Austin, where they locked out the podium. I think one of only 4 times in Moto2 history that they've managed to do that, as Dixon has proven that he's right back up in the running. Only 2 interesting stories and rumours emerging last night in the paddock regards to the Marc VDS team. It does seem as though Jake Dixon's current crew chief, Luciano Castro, may well be on his way out of that squad next year. Aaron Canet, Dennis Onju, obviously going to be an all-new rider lineup in Marc VDS colours next year. And I saw Sky Italia reporting that Norman Rank, formerly Ayagura's crew chief during his victorious Moto2 campaign last year, currently working with Harrison Voigt with the QJ Motor Frinsa MSI squad. Looks as though Norman might be moving across to work with Aaron Canet.
2 characters I'm looking forward to seeing work together.
2 characters, full stop.
Yeah,
exactly. I hope Marina Rossi, the coordinator of Marc VDS, has plenty of energy, plenty of patience to try and control that pair, for sure. But yeah, Norman confirmed that this morning, that he will be going to VDS next year to work with Canet. And yeah, you'd have to say, not just Norman's experience with working in the Moto2 category, working obviously with Ayagura successfully, showed that he could be a World Championship winning crew chief, but also just his knowledge of the Boscoscuro chassis. He could show last year Agura with a quite different setting to what the other Boscoscuro riders were using, could be so successful and could really use his own riding style. I think that could be quite interesting for Canet next year. And Canet, we've always said, it can be so up and down, even this year, which has probably been his most consistent Grand Prix season to date. Even in the kind of mid to late part of the season, we've seen some real tail-offs in results. And Norman might be the slightly out there character that can properly relate to Aaron next year. So yeah, very, very excited to see that combination at work.
Yeah, and the just complete the reports from Sky Italia, where in terms of what Luciano Castro is up to, the reports are that he could be heading across to the American racing team to be Joe Roberts' crew chief for next season. We know, of course, for rather serious reasons, Joe Roberts hasn't had his customary normal crew chief through this season due to some health problems for his original crew chief at the start of the season, who we continue to wish all the very best. Here is your new session leader, Mario Adji, a 140.268 he's just put in, which has put him half a second clear now of Dixon. Guevara currently on course to potentially retake top spot. He does. Here he is on the 28, a 140.218. Actually sick yesterday. Said he felt good from the very first lap of practice yesterday. And given what he's been through this season, of course, with the shoulder surgery, it dislocated on several occasions at the start of the season, right from the Jerez test. Prix Buriram actually was having problems with his shoulder popping out, which forced him to go under the surgeon's knife following the Spanish Grand Prix. And he described the race in Indonesia as the hardest of his career for even a local or for a native in Indonesia. He found it a really tough weekend physically because, I guess, of the lack of training and this physical preparation he's been able to do with that dislocated shoulder being operated on midway through the summer. But he's getting closer to his self once again, and he said yesterday was a really important day mentally in his attempts to rediscover the form at the start of the season, which saw him make qualifying 2 in each of the first 4 Grand Prix, and took, of course, his best Moto2 results in the wet in Austin when he finished inside the top 10.
Yeah, really impressive times this from Adji. As Lewis was saying, comfortably the best Calyx in this session so far, with Dixon, Guevara and Otola all around him. You can see Diogo Moreira has gone out and has just come straight back in again. I don't even think he has set a flying lap. No, he hasn't. Just confirming on the timing screens. Just checked the weather forecast very briefly there, and I mean, it's not like it's tried and trusted and it's 100% accurate, as regular listeners to us, Lewis, will well know, but it does say that there shouldn't be any more rain here on Phillip Island today. So with a bit of luck, this might be the only wet session that we have for the Moto2 riders, and maybe will not be the most relevant when it comes to the end of the day, the end of the week.
Tyre management, he feels the tyres of which they are a step harder here this weekend than what we'd see at most Grand Prix on the calendar. We have the hardest available rear tyre here, in addition to a development of the medium rear tyre, which was used back at the Sachsenring to cope with the very specific demands of that circuit. And it's a circuit here too where the left-hand side of the tyre takes particularly a pounding, especially through those final left-handers in Sector 4. But by contrast to that, Senna Aegis, he said that you need to be very, very accurate when the tyre starts to drop around about a half distance in the Grand Prix, around about lap 10, 11 or 12 or so. Here is Senna on screens. Because you really need to be very, very precise, very careful to make sure that you don't overstress the left-hand side of that rear tyre. Because as we have seen in all classes of Grand Prix racing here at Phillip Island, when the tyre does drop, it drops severely.
Yeah, you just have to think back to the 2023 MotoGP race here when Jorge Martin dropped in pace. It really did fall off a cliff, and he was just absolutely powerless to prevent that gaggle of 4 riders behind from swallowing him up. They come within 1 lap of great success, and just can't wait to see MotoGP tomorrow. It does seem as though there's going to be a real mix of strategies out there, but we'll be coming on to that a little bit more when MotoGP FP2 comes up just after this one. Matt Burt, Lewis Sotheby, Jack Appleyard will be talking you through that one, and you can see on our timing screens that these potential fastest times from Ethan Guevara, Jake Dixon might be taking a bit of a pounding in the laps to come, not least from Marcos Ramirez.
Yeah, I do wonder whether Ramirez has put some slicks on at the end of this session, because he was 2 seconds up through the halfway stage. He's then lost 1.5 seconds through Sector 3, potentially where there's a very fine dry line through some of the faster corners. Let's look at Ramirez. Certainly looks like he's got a slick on the front of that tyre as he comes towards view. Second place for the 24. And as long as he keeps himself on the dry tarmac, he'll just build and build and build in the 4 minutes that remain, which should be enough time for 3 laps for him. Dixon into the 38s now as he takes over from Guevara. 1:38.935, 20 riders have set a lap time in this session at the moment. Joe Roberts, who was one of those who stayed longest in the pits, has now joined the session.
Yeah, it doesn't look as though Diogo Moreira has any intention of going out. And again, same could be said for Senna Aegis, who we just saw on our screens. You can see there Dixon still got a nice bit of scratching to the bodywork on the right-hand side when he tipped off down at the MG hairpin, but thankfully it hasn't affected his speed at all, as you can see towards the end of the session. This will be quite a bit of confidence boosting from Ethan Guevara as he comes round. You can see bits of the rear tyre just flicking off as he applies the throttle. And Guevara, who didn't quite meld with his track yesterday as comfortably as he was doing so in Indonesia, this could potentially give him a bit of a boost before qualifying later.
Dixon then descends into the hairpin of turn 10, which caught him out earlier on. Safety through this time. Yeah, Ramirez has to be on slicks, given that he's 2 seconds and change up. Arbolino also going very, very well up behind Ramirez. As you already pointed out, Neil, just to my right, pointing to the screens and pointing at the rear tyre of Ramirez, which is certainly giving him plenty of grip as he gets us down into the 135s. 3 seconds clear of Dixon, with the added benefit of some dry weather tyres. Arbolino into second.
Yeah, that's going to be a big relief, I think, to some MotoGP riders that will be looking to do some longer runs. Maybe some of the medium tyres that Michelin have brought here. I'm looking at Pecco Bagnaia in particular, who had a real up and down day yesterday. The fact that these Moto2 riders are using slicks right at the end of the session. So I think Joe Roberts is another one that's probably stuck some slicks on. We get a look at Ethan Butbol, proprietor of the American racing team. Just keeping it nice and steady there through the hay shed. You don't want to be making any kind of mistakes through there, as we saw from Max Keeler. So the 2 American racing riders are on slicks as it stands, and Ramirez is really putting some tense in to his adversaries at the end of this session.
And when conditions are sort of on that crossover point as they are now between dry and wet, it's all about tyre temperature. When you have the slicks on, you want to build up as much temperature as you can. Because of course, the more temperature you've got, the more the tyres are going to grip and bite into the surface. If you're on the wet tyres, you want to try and keep the tyres cool and stop the temperatures from going up through the roof, because they're just going to burn up and you're going to lose the tread blocks of those tyres, and they're not going to be clearing the water away and giving you that grip that you require on a predominantly dry surface, which is why in drying conditions, when they're on wet tyres, you often see them going over onto the wet part of the track. Arbolino then down to a 34.0 now. He's just ahead of Ramirez, so we're under 4 seconds now away from the lap times they were doing yesterday. And Arbolino was the second fastest at Boscoscuro yesterday, saying that they made a big step forward at Blue Crew Pramac with his Boscoscuro. Fair to say that Mandalika wasn't Arbolino's most enjoyable weekend, in part down to an incident at turn 1, which dropped into the back of the field. But Arbolino, having made some obvious clear progress from Misano and Bategi, where he finished both races inside the top 10, looks like he's in the mood for another top 10 challenge, if not better here.
Yeah, definitely does seem so. He came into this weekend saying that right arm, which has been giving him so many problems this year, is finally healed and back to full strength after he had surgery to alleviate some arm pump just after the home race at Misano in September. We saw that yesterday with Arbolino's times. Hard to believe that it's 2 years ago, 2 full years ago, since Tony Arbolino last won a Moto2 race. It of course came at that rain-affected, weather-affected Grand Prix in 2023. He somehow managed to keep it upright and keep it right at the front in those awful conditions in a race that was red flagged early. It wasn't just horrible, dark and rainy, it was also very, very windy indeed. And hasn't been on top of Moto2 since then, unfortunately, but it is good to see him getting back towards his best at the tail end of this season. I do believe that he has signed a deal to move across to Fantic next year to replace the outgoing Aaron Canet. But one or two holds up with the fact that he has actually got maybe a 2-year deal with Yamaha, and they're trying to find a way in which he can exit that and move across from the Blue Crew squad into Fantic Racing. Gino Gorsoy looks on with a little smile. He'll obviously be fancying his MotoGP riders' chances in these kinds of conditions here at the Phillip Island circuit. And Don Chacon is rubbing his hands together.
So Arbolino, Ramirez and Roberts, your top 3. You're all in the session on slick tyres. You can just see in the corner of the picture there, what looked like one of the intact bikes. Senna Agius and Manuel Gonzalez. Agius just glancing down our screens, did not set a time in that session. Gonzalez did, but it was the slowest of all the riders who did go out there and register a time. Manuel Gonzalez 22nd in that session. Perhaps not taking the ultimate risks in conditions like this when, as mentioned earlier on, there was plenty to lose, essentially, when you are leading the World Championship. So Baltus was 4th. He was late out onto the track from Angie, Dixon, Guevara, Lopez, Munoz and Huertas, whose dent on this session unfortunately came at the expense of one of the local seagulls here in Phillip Island, which saw that red flag come out a little bit earlier on. see much from Aegis in that session, as the 81 just goes through the picture there ahead of Marcos Ramirez. There's every reason why the thousands who are packing into Phillip Island this morning should be very excited about Senna's prospect here this weekend. Qualifying, though, this afternoon is going to be so crucial for Senna. As we have seen quite often this season, he's qualified perhaps lower than his ultimate potential suggests that he should be. If Senna can get himself on the front 2 rows here this afternoon, you feel he's got a real chance of home victory tomorrow. But it's Tony Arbolino who topped this morning's mixed conditions FP2. Arbolino, Ramirez and Roberts all putting slicks on at the end to take the top 3 spots. Barry Baltus 4th from Mario Aggi and Jake Dixon, who took 6th after crashing at turn 10. Ethan Cavara 7th from Alonso Lopez, Danny Munoz and the enemy of the Seagulls, Adrian Huerta. Ivan Otola 11th from Alex Escridge, Danny Holgado and Zonta van den Gorber. Colin Vire 15th, ahead of Yuki Kuni, Yumi Sasaki, Jorge Navarro and Celestino Vietti. Harrison Boyd at the end took P20 from David Alonso and points leader Madu Gonzalez. The 6 other riders all didn't set a time, which includes yesterday's pace setters Diogo Moreira and Senna Aegis. But it's Tony Arbolino who tops the free practice 2 session in Moto2, which started on wet and ended on slicks. We'll be on slicks in MotoGP in just a moment. Their free practice 2 session is moments away.
Saturday takes centre stage at Australia's jaw-dropping natural paradise of Phillip Island for round 19 in 2025. Home to the well-renowned Penguin Parade and blessed with countless coastal hotspots, Phillip Island always delivers high-octane thrills and nail-biting battles. Who will power to pole down under? As we go qualifying live ahead of a 13-lap sprint showdown, it's time for MotoGP.
Practice 2 session.
The 13-lap sprint showdown. It's time for MotoGP.